Good morning to our second day of conferences, the conference, The Terms of Habitation. For the ones who were not with us yesterday, the conference is the first outcome of an investigation conducted in the frame of the research group Retheorizing the Architecture of Housing as a Ground for Research and Practice, and has the main aim on the one side to propose a map of recent tendencies and research line in historical, not only historical housing studies in the last years, but at the same time to try to use terminology as an entry point, but also as a method to investigate the relation between housing and architecture and this kind of divorce that seems to emerge in the last decade in housing research and design. So our session, through a simplification, of course, is titled Policy. I am Gaia Caramellino. I am assistant professor in History and Theory of Architecture and Urban History at the Politecnico di Milano, the Department of Architecture and Urban Studies. And I am happy to chair this session that, as I told before, we tried to title Policy, and that we will see how we maybe can question this notion today. The session is co-hosted by Zafir. I would like to thank him, Zafir Fainot. I would like to thank him for supporting me today in the chairing of the session. We will have only 3 speakers, and the 3 terms that we are going to investigate, question, and discuss are affordable rights and needs. I will then introduce our speakers. I want to remind you that through this presentation, the goal is also to try to provide a specific perspective, a specific angle in the investigation of terms. So terms sometimes are used to introduce policies, sometimes are used as an occasion, an excuse to investigate architectural typologies. But what is interesting is also the shifting meaning that will emerge, we will see, in the analysis of these terms from one field to the other, one disciplinary realm to the other, but also through diverse geographies. We asked all the presenters, all the speakers to focus on the context that they investigated on one specific place, but through our discussion we will try to understand how many connections we can establish between the presentation and how this notion travel in times and spaces, often generating also a process of revision, reinterpretation, and appropriation. I think we can start the session. It's framed like we proposed today through the 15 minutes presentation, video recorded presentation, and then we will have immediately after the presentation 50 minutes devoted to the questions, specific questions related to the paper and to the discussion of specific aspects of the papers. While at the end, after the 3 presentation and the discussion on the specific contributions, we will have sometimes for a general debate that we would like also to open to all the participants and questions that can in some way cross the 3 researches and the 3 presentations on the terms, affordable rights and needs. So I think that I can unshare these and open the first presentation that is perfect. I will briefly introduce our speakers before. We have 3 speakers. The first speaker is Gisela Lameira, an architect and researcher within the Atlas da Casa. Sorry if I cannibalize the words with this pronunciation. That is a housing, architectural design and forms of dwelling. It's a working group based at the Center for Studies in Architecture and Urbanism. She She has a PhD in architecture at the Faculty of Architecture and Urbanism of Porto, and her research interests include the study of architecture and urban theory and history, specifically the genesis and transformation of multi-family housing in Portugal. She worked as a research fellow on the project Mapping Public Housing, a critical review of the state-subsidized residential architecture in Portugal that investigates the period between 1910 and 1974, and is currently undertaking a research for the projects Aging in Place, Architecture for Aging and Independent Living Design at the Faculty of Architecture and Urbanism of Porto. The second speaker is Rui Ramos. He's an architect and full professor at the Faculty of Architecture, University of Porto, where he teaches project studio in the integrated master's degree and theory of architecture for today in the PhD program in architecture. He developed his own architectural office between 1983 and 2003, and now he is a researcher at the Center for Studies in Architecture and Urbanism. He was the PI, the principal investigator of the already mentioned the interdisciplinary project Mapping Public Housing, a critical review of the state-subsidized residential architecture in Portugal. And his researches and studies focus on the special devices of the house, the relation between culture and forms of dwelling, on mass housing programs, and he's now developing a new, renewed understanding for what defining inclusive architect from aging to sustainability, on which he's in publishing works. He has several roles at the school, the University of Porto, and he's now president of the Faculty Scientific Council. The third research that I'm going to introduce is Luciana Rocha. She is an architect and researcher at the Center for Studying Architecture and Urbanism, as a PhD in architecture from the Faculty of Architecture at the University of Porto. Her research focuses on preservation of built heritage, the analysis of intervention strategies in multi-family housing buildings from the half 20th centuries, questioning the adaptability and flexibility of this construction in adjusting the current requirement of domestic comfort. She was also a research fellow on the project Mapping Public Housing that I mentioned before, and she's currently developing research in architectural design on built heritage with the particular interest to preservation measure and sustainability strategies. So thank you to our three speakers. I will start the presentation.
This paper was co-written by three researchers from the University of Porto, Portugal. Rui Jorge Garcia Ramos, architect and full professor at the Faculty of Architecture, Gisela Lameira and Luciana Rocha, both also architects and researchers at the Center for Studies in Architecture and Urbanism from the Faculty of Architecture. This research was developed as part of the funded project Mapping Public Housing and has been undertaken at the Center for Studies in Architecture and Urbanism, CEAU, of the Faculty of Architecture, FAU, at the University of Porto. Over the last 100 years, the term affordable has frequently been used in the vocabulary of urban housing in Portugal, being linked to other words commonly used in housing construction, such as econômica, economical, barata, cheap, inexpensive, low cost, pobre, poor, cooperativa, cooperative, or even custos controlados, controlled costs. Although a wide range of different words were used to describe affordable housing in Portugal from the early 20th century until the first decade of the 21st century, it is essential to stress the importance of a number of newly emerging concepts. In recently implemented laws, concepts such as economicamente acessível, economically accessible, and custos controlados, controlled costs, low costs, encompass the shifts in the meaning of the term affordable and broaden the contemporary discussion of the housing problem in relation to the type of property and target audience. As in other international contexts, nowadays, the construction of affordable housing raises several questions, given the significant escalation in house prices. There is a lack of housing solutions, not only for the disadvantaged population, but mostly for the middle classes who cannot afford to rent or buy houses in the property market. In this sense, the Portuguese housing crisis is due in part to the lack of affordable homes, in other words, homes that are accessible to ordinary people. In this article, we are not focusing on how housing affordability is currently measured in Portugal or its definition, which would be a whole field on its own, but how the concept of affordability is evolving in Portuguese language among policymakers, architects, and researchers. Between 1910 and 1974 in Portugal, the term affordable was commonly used to identify low-cost housing solutions for certain strata of the population with variable incomes. This term was appropriated by the main initiatives in housing construction implemented by the different political regimes from the First Republic, 1910-1926, with programs such as the Social Housing District, 1919, to the Estado Novo Dictatorship, 1933-1974, in the form of various housing programs. These programs contributed to the construction of a significant number of dwellings across the country and motivated the development of other organizations and promoters with administrative and financial autonomy, such as the Fund for the Development of Social Housing Schemes, 1969. The implemented programs were based on different property regimes. For example, the Affordable Houses Program, 1933, was based on a rental purchase principle. The monthly rent paid off the value of the house within 25 years, with the result that the buildings passed from the public to the private sector, even allowing for the apartments to be subsequently sold to other owners. Another example was the rental dwellings built under the Affordable Rented Houses Program, 1945, that later could also be acquired by the respective owners under a specific decree law from 1977. The buildings constructed for rent were divided into autonomous units and transformed into horizontal property regimes. The plan for constructing new housing, 1959, is also worthy of consideration as it included three of the most extensive urban operations built in Lisbon in the early 1960s, namely the neighborhoods of Olivais Norte, Olivais Sul, and Chelas. This program established a general plan for the construction of affordable rental housing in the city of Lisbon, which involved several housing developers. The local ambulatory support service emerged shortly after the revolution of 25 April 1974. The SAL intended to address the accentuated housing shortage widespread across the country in a participatory process with the direct and active involvement of the population. After this significant initiative in the 1980s, the construction of controlled costs housing arose both for sale and for rental. One of the promoters is the housing cooperatives through access to special housing credits. Subsequently, in 1993, the Special Rehousing Program was introduced with the aim of eliminating the slum areas existing in Lisbon and Porto. As a result, this program had a substantial impact on the social and territorial development of these metropolitan centers. The government approach to the housing problem has involved progressive investments in the construction industry, leading to the building of homes through special financing policies. The first versions of the subsidized credit regime for home ownership date from 1976, followed by the subsidized credit system introduced in 1983. These subsidized credit support measures were abandoned in 2002. Most of the financing and promotion of state-subsidized housing in Portugal is regulated by the Portuguese Institute for Housing and Urban Rehabilitation, IRU. This public institute is also responsible for managing and providing maintenance for the existing social housing stock, as well as for promoting and putting into practice public policies relating to accessible housing solutions. Given the current housing crisis in Portugal, several programs have been implemented as a result of the new generation of housing policies 2018. These programs are directed at different fringes of the population, such as young people, middle classes, the poorest strata of the population, landlords, investors, or people who want to move to the countryside, targeting several types of solutions for rental housing, refurbishment, urban regeneration, etc. Financial support or subsidies for rental models instead of ownership and rehabilitation strategies are the most notable instruments for the promotion and management of housing. The same discussion has centered on policies for the refurbishment of the current housing stock and new regulations. In order to achieve these goals, the following strategic objectives are pursued and the following instruments adopted. To respond to families that live in a situation of severe housing shortage, the First Right Housing Access Support Program and the Getaway Urgent Accommodation Support Program. To guarantee access to housing for those who do not have an answer through the market, the Affordable Rental Program, the DOOR 65 Young People, the Supported Rental Regime, and the National Building Rehabilitation Fund, among other instruments. To make rehabilitation the main form of intervention at the level of buildings and urban development, the Rehabilitate for Rent affordable housing, the Financial Instrument for Urban Rehabilitation and Revitalization, and the Efficient Housing 2020, among other actions. And to promote social and territorial inclusion and housing choice opportunities, the House Mobility Program for Territorial Cohesion, key in hand. The challenge that Portugal has had to face over the last 5 years have been huge, and only at the beginning of 2020 did the instruments of the new generation of housing policies defined in 2018 begin to be implemented. The housing crisis was naturally aggravated by the COVID-19 pandemic, which not only highlighted the shortage of housing solutions, but has mostly underlined the lack of architectural quality of the current housing stock, with evident deficiencies in terms of comfort, salubriousness, livable areas, access to the exterior, etc. As the population grows older, social policies are beginning to shift from the provision of institutionalized care to keeping the older adults at their homes as a healthy solution for the aging problem. New challenges can therefore be expected to appear in terms of housing. Major changes in housing policies in this particular area, which have already been introduced in other countries over the last few decades, require a necessary revision of the current legal framework in Portugal and call for the involvement of a wide range of different stakeholders, namely the government, planners, housing promoters, builders, state agents, the financial system, and the tenants or buyers of the dwellings. Overall, future discussions of this question must be centered on the house as an asset that can meet the needs of inhabitants in the long run, taking into account specific or permanent changes in the circumstances of their daily lives. This means that from the point of view of housing design, a series of extra capabilities must be considered. This approach includes the development of manuals of good practices, checklists, and lifelong housing certification models, services for analyzing architectural and urban projects, reports and recommendations for housing policies. Under the scope of such rehabilitation, the new generation of housing policies 2018 proposes a set of policy instruments with an emphasis on the urban rehabilitation program in social housing districts, energy efficiency, which supports interventions in affordable housing buildings aimed especially at energy and environmental issues. This legislation also covers the remaining housing ensembles with instruments such as Efficient House 2020, which promotes interventions associated with energy and water efficiency and an improvement in urban solid waste management. These themes are gaining increasing importance and attracting greater government attention, which is reflected in the current incentives. An example is a support program for more sustainable buildings, which consists of a contest launched on 7 September 2020 for the financial support, maximum 70%, of small interventions in houses dating from before 2006. In this context, it is essential to reinforce the adoption of measures relating both to the type of construction, social, and to its geographical and climatical conditions. The transposition of Central European standards to the national reality does not necessarily represent an improvement in housing. This short 100 years overview of housing policies and discussion of the term affordable underlines that the housing issue has been a political weapon throughout history and still continues to be so nowadays. A review of the different housing promotion initiatives throughout the 20th century reveals that the current housing crisis can only be resolved through strong state support for municipal housing development, as shown by the results obtained between 1910 and 1974. Nevertheless, during this long period of time, there were clearly some ideological changes introduced in terms of housing policies, underlining the shifts that were taking place in the role of the welfare state. This phenomenon can be clearly observed in the strategies that were implemented to encourage house purchase from the late 1970s until 2002. Nowadays, different strategies are being pursued, as has already been described. The most evident change in the past 20 years has been the extension of the scope of action to rehabilitation instead of new housing construction, and most of all to investment in rental solutions instead of home ownership. Certain initiatives began to gain momentum in the late 1980s, especially cooperative housing. In this case, the state's investment ended up translating into a profit for the owners, who, once the period during which they were prevented from selling their houses had expired, ended up placing them on the real estate market. Another controversial housing policy in Portugal that ended in September 2002 was the subsidized credit regime, nowadays only available for citizens with disabilities. The public investment in the acquisition of new housing through subsidized credits result in massive investments being made by the state, which are still being paid for in the annual state budget. The 2020 pandemic has led to the emergence of a number of new themes such as healthy housing, naturally related with aging in place, lifelong housing, and energy efficiency retrofit. It is expected that in future years in Portugal, the term affordable, which is currently understood as generally meaning accessible, that is something that a regular citizen can rent or buy, will broaden its meaning to include adaptability, accessibility, aging, independent living, and other related concepts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for a presentation that was extremely clear. I find really, really interesting the way you traced through an historical perspective over the 20th century, the changing significance and meaning of affordable, but to arrive to question the meaning that the notion of affordable can have today through diverse intervention that in some way show the response to a new complexity, different needs. So the fact of questioning the meanings that affordable can have today, I think with this historical perspective, it's extremely challenging. I like it. I would like, before, I would have some questions, specific questions, but I would like before to ask the participants if there are specific questions for Gisela, Louis, and Luciana, and then if not, I will pose my questions.
Gaia, there is a question in the chat, but I think you can just open your mic and
exactly, yes. Since we have time, I think we discussed it with Safir. It would be better if we can just open your camera and pose the question to Gisela and Luciana and Rui directly.
Yeah. So I see Sandra wants to ask a question. So just unmute your mic and you can go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. Sandra.
Yes. Hello, hello everyone. Gisela, many thanks for the talk. And my question was, is there a distinction that one makes between, the question comes from, let's say, an American context where there's a distinction between affordable and public housing. Is there such a distinction in the way you, and the context in which you have addressed that? Because you're talking about an opening of the notion, and well,
yes, well, in Portugal during the first century, affordable meant like economical or houses for low-cost houses for the poor people. Nowadays, we don't see the concept like that. For us, affordable is like accessible housing. Housing someone can pay. That means that it's housing for mostly for middle class people.
So you say that the term has translated into something else across time, but is that in contrast to something that would be the equivalent of public housing?
No.
Since affordable is for the middle class, what has become the term for the poor?
It's the same. We don't distinguish the concept. Affordable houses is accessible houses for a different range of the population. So it can be state subsidized, or it can be built by privates. But nowadays we are building a concept that means an asset that someone can buy or rent. It's so we nowadays we don't see the concept as something the state has to provide, but as a general concept of an accessible asset for everyone. I guess, but in the past, yes, the affordable houses were built or state subsidized by subsidized. So, but now I think in Portugal we don't see it, and the government doesn't see it that way.
Okay. Thanks.
Other questions?
So Nelson, Nelson wanted to ask.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Gisela. And because this is indeed, I mean, and also the work that you've been doing with your project, I think it's amazing, because it really brings together things that were completely, let's say, well, shattered and dispersed all over the place. But indeed, even following up the question that Sandra just asked, so I have the feeling that there is indeed another kind of or in terms of the terminology related with housing, there's this idea of social housing, right? I mean, but in the sense that it's housing for the economically weaker section of the society, those that qualify to get subsidies from the state. But that actually in Portugal is quite charged and even stigmatized, right? So people who live in social housing schemes or neighborhoods are really the poor people, really the people who, I mean, nobody wants to live there if you can live elsewhere. And I think, I mean, or at least I leave it to you to sort of to approach this. Whereas affordable housing, as you rightly mentioned, now it's actually quite a central issue for indeed starters, young couples, and people who don't have a permanent job and thus struggle to have bank loans and these sort of things. And then in the end, there's also another particular aspect of Portugal, which is the percentage of rental housing is really, really, really small. Because there's this culture of ownership, and the banks and the 1980s sort of, process of, basically giving anyone that would ask for a loan, the banks will just give it. No, no questions asked, because the collateral was the house itself. So for them, was no risk involved. And this sort of created also another stigma, which is renting, it's a bad business. So all these things considered, what strikes me is that at this point, what does it mean affordable housing in terms of design? I mean, what are the examples today in Portugal of, let's say, of affordable housing design? So is it something that is taught at universities? Is it taught, let's say, do students get, a specific education on that? Or is it something that it's without consideration?
Well, I think nowadays we are just starting to talk about these things about affordable housing as someone accessible to everyone, and not only the poor people. So the perception I get is at faculties, no, we are not discussing these terms, because in our faculty at FALP, in the third year, students develop a project on housing, collective housing, and they are still designing the same typologies for the state market. So I guess we are not. We are still trying to discuss these emergent concepts. And yes, in Portugal, there's a stigmatization about social housing, because the state made large investments only in housing for the poor people in the past. So I guess that this term, discussing this term of affordability, designing houses for everyone, and not trusting that the market will solve everything, is very important today. But I think another concept that is really important and shows a shift in thinking in Portugal is that we are putting the efforts in rental houses and refurbishment. So I think we are still watching, and these two instruments that we have, the new generation housing policies, and from 2018, and the new basic housing law from 2019 are very recent. The platforms are available to people to apply and to try to find accessible housing from different fringes of the population. The instruments that, for example, we showed in the presentation show that are different instruments. We are not only trying to get accessible housing for the poor. We have solutions for several kinds of people in Portugal. But also the refurbishment is a very important question today. So I think in the next years we'll see several changes in Portugal. Yesterday I read the news in the newspaper that's the Secretary of Housing said that in 2022 all public housing stock will be rehabilitated and made accessible for people. Well, I think it's a bit overwhelming, but we will see in the next years what happens in Portugal, because there's the government is very I think some changings will occur. I don't know if it will take 10 years or 5 years, but I think in Portugal we'll make a huge step in this question of providing housing for everyone. I don't know if Lucy.
I'd just like to say something about this question. That is that the history of the state subsidized housing in Portugal has shown that it's also possible to do quality architectural buildings for inaccessible costs. And one thing that has changed in the last years is that the population that lives in some of those buildings are not the poor people, it's the artists and the young people that want to live in that buildings, like Torres Vermelhas da Pasteleira and the Bolsa from CISA. And so it's possible to do quality architectural in the present to achieve these goals. And I would like to introduce this topic for the discussion.
Thank you. That was indeed actually something that I was hinting at. Some of the examples that you showed, for instance, in Olivais, in Pasteleira. So the examples from the 60s and 70s that's where you had the best architects of the country, developing innovative housing design. And since then, since the mid 70s, there is very, very, very scarce. I mean, you really need to dig very deep to try and find, let's say, an architect that has been consistently working and innovating in terms of housing design. And then I wonder, is that something that it's because of educational? Is it because of policies? Is it because, housing is not relevant? I don't think that that's the list, at least. Thank you.
Thank you, Nelson.
Thank you. Are there other comments? If not, I jump in the conversation. Maybe there was Yankel, I don't know. We cannot hear you, Yankel, sorry.
Hi there.
Okay, perfect. Oh, sorry.
Hi there. I'm going to really confuse you because I'm speaking with a Scottish accent from Melbourne in Australia. Thank you very much for the presentation. I run the affordable housing research group at the University of Melbourne, so I was really keen to listen in. And we've got some huge affordability challenges over here in Melbourne. Just to give you a bit of context, if we talk about social housing, which over here, that's what we look at in relation to the subsidised end of the market, we're talking 3.4% of the housing stock is social housing compared to, you look at cities like Vienna's 25%, and you look at London's 24%, Copenhagen is maybe 19%, Amsterdam 40%. So I am curious about places like Lisbon, what the affordability of social housing percentages are. But one of the key drivers, policy drivers here in Australia that we're lobbying the government for is inclusionary zoning, which I know in America is heavily used, in the UK it's heavily used, and in Denmark it's heavily used, which is a policy driver for the private sector to create a percentage of affordable housing in any development. And it's becoming mandatory over here that we are going to develop 15 to 20% of affordability. In England, you're talking anywhere between 25% and 40% of all new housing has to provide a level of subsidised affordable housing. And I know in America it's a huge issue. So I was curious if inclusionary zoning is something that's been talked about in Portugal, if it's something you're familiar with.
In Portugal, I don't have numbers about the affordable houses, but the new generation housing policies states that the government wants to have 170,000 dwellings in the next affordable houses. Or affordable dwellings in the next years. 170,000. It's huge. And in Portugal, we are facing a really hard housing crisis. I don't know if the government has the current numbers for affordable houses made in the last years, but what we know is that in the 80s and the 90s there were a large disinvestment in a welfare state. So the government thought that the market would solve the housing question, and which threw us to a massive housing crisis. So I don't know. I don't have recent numbers about affordable houses built in Portugal, but I know that there is nothing being built in the last years in Portugal. I don't know if Luciana wants to have something, because she works more with the social housing rehabilitation. I don't know if she has another perspective.
Well, I have the same question. I don't have the numbers of the current social housing, only the historical perspective that we have built with the Mapping Public Housing database. So it's the same question, the same answer. I'm sorry.
I'd like to add to that, if I may. There's a work by Dr. Inés Calora, she's Portuguese, and she looks also at the process of formality, because Portugal is one of the European capitals of informality, and the process of formalization also changed the market. So that's another thing. It's not only the disinvolvement of the government in public construction, it's also the formalization that came from the other side to limit, what the quantities of houses released.
I don't understand the question.
It was just a comment and a suggestion to look at the work of another architect, Inés Calora, that has published formality, the property regime, and the issue of tenure that has also modified the structure of the Portuguese housing market.
Okay, there was still one question, I think.
Yankel, maybe if you take off the headphones, sometimes it causes the microphone not to work. Maybe because of that we can't hear you.
Well, in the meantime, while Yankel arrives, I have just a remark, but I think we can also consider it for the final discussion, because it crosses several presentations. I would like to highlight that the request to work on affordable housing for the presentation and for the paper has a lot of implication, because in their research they worked on the Portuguese notions and how it changed in different moments in different political and ideological frames. So there is not only a linguistic concern, but many nuances that in the analysis of the terms emerged also in the project are difficult to be grasped and captured if we think in a monolithic way to the term affordable. But what I wanted to say that in your analysis, you wrote, I think, an important chapter of architectural history, because the history of affordable housing, trying to trace a chronology, so to define a time frame over the 20th century, remain a little bit on the margin of the narratives of architectural history. So my question is also related to what Nelson said before. In Italy, this notion of affordable is a kind of, we can say, umbrella term that it indicates a legal framework So a structure that encourage the interaction between public and private forms of negotiations, and the same cooperative emerge as a response, of course, to be active in the frame of affordable housing. But it's not related to specific moments of architectural research or to specific typologies. There is not this connotation. So I wanted to know if you think that in this narrative that look at policies that in some way interact planning tools, architectural research, or other fields that cross the stories of affordable housing, you can also find an interaction in the research of specific typology. So architectural experimentation and research, if there is this or there is this divorce between what is affordable housing as a policy and legal frame and architectural research on housing.
Well, I think that's a very complex question. But
no, we can answer, maybe if you want, we can discuss at the end, because I think it's related to this shift between architecture and housing provision that it's at the core of our discussion. But the linguistic point, I think it's important in your case, because of course
in Portugal we are architects, politicians, we are always trying to look to economic construction, to spend the less and build the much as we can. So the term affordable, we use it as económica, barata, mas with quality, but with quality. So it's a complex thing, because we don't use the term affordable. In Portuguese, is not, we don't like, I guess that in Portuguese, affordable is the same as accessible. Well, exactly. But we don't use that term.
Exactly, yes. And the roots of the same notion of affordable is something that can maybe keep together all these papers that address
the term economical construction, maybe low-cost construction. We don't associate economic to social. Nowadays, it's not. We are not used to associate these terms like low cost and social. Well, there are lots of good examples, lots of good social buildings that are well constructed and with quality. So we don't associate economic to social. But the term affordable is more like a concept, and not a term that we use in construction industry, or we use it in research, but maybe politicians are now picking this concept to discuss ideas and how we will manage our future in housing. But I guess in the past, the term affordable meant economical, just like that.
Thank you. Yankel, sorry if I jumped in the conversation, then we move to the second presentation. We cannot hear you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Yankel, we cannot hear you. Maybe we can try to plug off the headphones and use the. No, it doesn't work. It doesn't work.
If you agree, Yankel, I can introduce yourself and start the presentation, and in the final moment of discussion, we can restart from this point. Is okay? So in the meantime, you can collate. Okay, so I will.
Sorry, Gaia, Rui is calling me. I think he has a problem. He can't enter the session. He says he has to be allowed.
So Zafir has to admit him. Okay.
Okay,
thank you for letting. Okay. So I will share the screen. So I apologize for and introduce Yankel. Okay. I think we can introduce the next speaker, who is Yankel Fischerkov. We already met him this morning. He's a sociologist and urban planner, as he's the professor at the School of Architecture of Paris University. He's the co-director of the laboratory, the Centre de Recherche sur l'Habitat, and a member of a team of La Luciana Lab. His main research is investigated social housing, housing standards and unhealthy housing, the history of the urban and housing policies. He has published several books in French on the social construction of unhealthy city during the city, and it's going to be published in December 2012, the book Narratives on 6 Cities, Essays on Urban Sociology. So we will start Yankel's presentation, and then we will have 15 minutes of discussion with him about his talk.
Of needs from housing policies to architecture in the French example. By the end of the century, the global population is said to reach over 11 billion. With the global population rising comes the inevitable rise in demand for housing. Homeless people live in slums. Housing has become the most pressing issue facing government this century. These 10 last years, many demonstrations against housing shortage, speculation, and decent housing have happened in the world. In this presentation, I will try to illustrate the circulation of the notion of needs through different fields in policy, social change, and architecture. This completes the history of a notion of comfort led by Cromwell in terms of sensitivity, history of sensitivity. As anthropologist Paul Rabinoff, who studied French modernism, urbanism, we need a better understanding of a notion of which is at the heart of the construction process of housing standards. In this perspective, I focus on the terms and words used by the technicians who are the producers and the users of their home language, and I consider the words as a narrative that show housing as a normative system. This presentation of the French case in a historical perspective covers a very rich period from the mid-19th century to the present. It characterized by the development of housing statistics in the 19th century, the intervention of public authorities such as Baron Haussmann, the construction of larger housing estates in the 1950s. I propose 3 periods representative of the reflection about needs: hygienic, postmodern, modern, and postmodern after 1950. The hygienic needs Rome policy. The 19th century corresponds to the entry of housing as a political question. The famous Engels books and his essay on housing question is a part of the dominant way of thinking in literature, politics, philosophy, economy. It is liable to the epidemic that affected our European countries. Slums and public health brings together physicians, politicians, and demographers. In France, the Unhealthy Housing Act, adopted in 1850, targets rented apartments whose characteristics are likely to harm the life or health of the inhabitants. Baron Haussmann used the Unhealthy Housing Act to consolidate his action on the working class neighborhood. Nevertheless, he mainly mobilized a decree law on the street of Paris that was much more authoritarian. Even its transformation of Paris raised the average standing of the city and made it attractive for the bourgeoisie. There was no improvement of housing conditions for the poorest. Walter Benjamin denounced the Haussmann spectacular urbanism that left many slums areas in the shadows of the Great Avenue. But the constituency of the unhealthy housing still raised question, and a universal definition of poor housing seemed necessary to rationalize public actions. Octave de Menil was one of the writers who debate in the Annals of Public Hygiene, the review, the pilot journal of the hygienist movement since the cholera epidemic of 1832. After a long debate, in 1891, the city of Paris set up a permanent office to organize its statistics. It appointed Jacques Bertillon, physicians and demographers. Jacques Bertillon published the first census of housing condition and mapped household overcrowding. He called his measure about house inhabitants, mal logés, and described the overcrowding in the apartment. For the first time, a statistical assessment of housing was carried out. Bertillon measured overcrowding in terms of persons per room. Research revealed that 23% of households lived in overcrowded housing. This map of overcrowding clearly refers to the working class neighborhoods in the northeast of Paris, and for moral statistics, overcrowding reflects demographic behavior. The other map on the left or the right is about death rate. To understand the needs that Jacques Bertillon speaks about, we should explicit that what was good housing in the post-Haussmannian context. This period has consecrated a type of apartment inspired by the aristocratic hotel, and in an Haussmannian apartment, the partitioning of the reception and intimate room is a basic principle of the Haussmann-style apartment, as well as the bedroom and its sanitary equipment. Thus, when Bertillon lamented that too many Parisian dwelling the working class cohabit parents and children in the same room, he had in mind the architectural principle of the Haussmann-style housing, divided by room, heated and designed for a smaller and large family. This design opposed the workers' way of life in the same room. In this urban half of the 19th century, the first social housing projects were led by these values. It includes separated rooms and the installation of on each floor of water pumps. Architects were solicited in competition organized by social organizations, and some of them read Bertillon works and gave a large content to the notion of hygienic architecture, quoting Alberti writing. Emile Trella introduced hygiene course into the curriculum of the Central School of Architecture. Louis Bonnier suggested that social housing architecture consists in adapting architecture to the needs, and Augustin Rey had built the first social housing for the Rothschild Foundation. His ideas on ventilation and sunlight were remained through Le Corbusier project of the Radiant City in 1935. After the Second World War, the reconstruction period revealed housing shortage due to demolition and the delay in construction since the beginning of the century. Government adopted rigorous method in 1953 to finance and organize the building process. The state normalized the production of housing, but opposing vision of the needs appraised to resolve the crisis. The general population of the French National Institute of Demography was mobilized in this topical issue. In 1946, the demographer Alfred Sauvé, who is in the left, supported the housing policy as a vehicle for a birth rate policy. In the same publication, the famous architect Le Corbusier proposed a functionalist program of the action founded on his modular model. His conception of needs leads to a normative conception of the housing practices. But the expression housing type shows that the issue of normal housing was central to the problem of that time. In 1943, while thinking about what will post-war housing will be, Henri Sellier, who was one of the pioneers of social housing, stated in the paper entitled Definition of Normal Housing, that technical factors worked with human habits. So the notion of needs required adaptable housing, and social science should contribute to the reflection. At the same period, the economist John Eloned published a sample study, and they shown that a third of Parisian dwelling had external water closed and 20% had running water. So the notion of need was summed up in equipment, particularly heat and sanitary equipment. But the reconstruction minister asked private team to study some rundown housing sectors. Economy humanism inspected each apartment with a grid to identify the qualities of housing, and the head household has answered to a survey questionnaire whose aim is to measure the sociability of the inhabitants, whether they have regular jobs, etc., and the quality of the furniture and the healthiness of the dwelling. Ventilation, sunshine, water supplies. This sheet make it possible to distinguish between different types of families and different types of housing. Within this framework, social housing integrated distinction between population, which correspond to different needs, and hierarchization as well. Building standards make it possible to rank the social level of social housing. A distinction was made between A and B social housing. It was based on whether the kitchen was designed to use for meals or not. If this is the case, the kitchen increased. The surface of a kitchen increased to the detriment of living room, and conversely for the other social housing. And the managers justify this distinction with a moral and popular version, and many architects, Dubuisson, Prouvé, Lodge, adopted it. For the poorest, the architect Jean Prouvé developed in 1957 a project of minimal house, well occupied in heating and sanitation, and less expensive. At the end, the notion of overcrowding remained central to the evolution of needs. Paul-Henri Chambardolov, the sociologist, was the first, after the post-war period, establishing an index based on the number of people per room as well on the surface area. The issue of residential stress was in line with the WHO's governance of consideration related to the physiological needs and the microclimate of housing. And the notion of housing of needs were opposed to aspiration. As needs refer to physiological factors, aspiration express how social group and spaces are really good. Chambardolov refers here to the work of Maslow, Abraham Maslow, who places self-esteem at the top of the pyramid of needs. And with this theoretical position, Chambardolov agreed the state statistic point of view on needs and the classification. In the post-millennium period, the diversification of lifestyle, the multiplication of actors pursuing the objectives of good housing, as well as environmental policies and digital techniques, have diversified the expectation. Since 1955, the issue of poor housing had become topical in France. There are nearly 4 million people with housing difficulties, including homeless people, camp dwellers, overcrowded, and few poverty households. Nevertheless, union of homeowners and builders of popular housing from home ownership support a minimalist current. They wish to reduce their costs and denounce the too numerous and restrictive reconstruction standards. Although excessive, their position leads to a reflection on the essential question of housing. The notion of need or aspirations, in the words of Chambardolov, emerged from the critique of living standard, and it expressed a need for anchoring and control environment. Different books in different language here. And it reflects an individualistic needs for against the technical standardization. It values social practices and advocates more space. It opposes the functionalism of one room and one function per room. A good example of architecture is the Bois le Prêtre Tower renewal project in Paris, which consisted in opening winter garden in each apartment. And the second trend is more collectivistic. Criticism of housing standards results to the increasingly widespread practices of collaborative architecture. It can result in the collectivization of services and were formally integrated into housing. In conclusion, what I can say is that the brief historical overview illustrates that the notion of needs structures the field of housing. It attests that the succession of norms of different actors which have different objectives and a translation project from one field to another. Thus, several tendencies are existent today on the field of housing standardization, hierarchization, and the search of alternatives. This leads to a dynamic that I call archipelization, the diversification of needs and the multiplication of systems of norms, values, and submarket. Today, it questions the minimum clarity. Ultimately, the notion of needs is essential because it makes possible to identify the narratives and the values on which housing policies and their architecture are based.
Thank you, Yankel, for the great presentation. I really liked how you questioned and investigated the notion of needs in its different, its shifting meaning and use in housing research over the 20th century. I would like just to add, sorry, forgot when I introduced the Yankel, I forgot to mention his publication, and I realized, so I would like just to do it right now. Yankel is the author of the book The Social Construction of Unhealthy Blocks in Paris between 1850 and 1945, Sociology of Cities, Sociology of Housing, and Telling the City, Doing the City as an editor. Okay, so I think that we can open the discussion. I would like to ask the participants to pose their questions, remarks, comments to Yankel's presentation. I don't know. I cannot see the chat. Safir, can you see it? So if it was really...
yes, the chat is open. It's
okay.
open.
Okay. So if well, while the participants frame their questions, I have a question for Yankel that is also a comment. In my research that I'm investigating, that I'm developing, sorry, for in the frame of this research group, I'm working on the codification of the notion of needs and its institutionalization from the settlement work in New York early century to the codes and standards of federal housing plan, and then to the instances of the war period when enter in the discourses of the architect. So I found interesting parallel in this research because the idea of measuring the needs that move from early century social reforms and settlement work then enter in the standards codes of the federal housing projects in the 30s. So, but we are always in this investigation dealing with facilities, equipments. So looking at another scale. I was wondering, Yankel, if in your research you are only focusing on the domestic space, so on the house, the apartment, or if there is also an interest into understanding this shift between needs, aspirations, and what you define the postmodern period, looking also at housing through facilities and equipment. I don't know if Yankel. Can you? Okay.
Yeah, Yankel, we can't hear you, but you can maybe write a short answer on the chat and we'll read it aloud.
I'm sorry if it's not working. Why? I don't know how. He's writing in the chat. It's okay.
Yes, in the chat, yes.
No, we cannot hear you. May you try without the...
No, we can't hear you.
No. Maybe in the meantime, if some other, while writing, Yankel is writing, had some comments or remarks or questions, we can collect.
Yankel wrote that he will quit and come back, so we'll give it a few minutes, or and we'll see if he will get back and we can hear him then.
Okay, maybe we wait a few minutes, because it would be important that he has the possibility to participate to the discussion. I think it's
of course. Okay, he's coming back. Okay. Let's hope it will work now. Yes.
No, we cannot. But now the microphone is deactivated. You have to microphone.
Yankel, can you unmute your microphone?
Yes. Your microphone is muted. Yes.
In the Zoom, Yankel, you can see in the Zoom window you have the microphone. It's muted now.
There is not the possibility to unmute, right, as a host?
You could just say to people to unmute. But, we'll wait a few minutes. Yes.
Yeah, because I cannot imagine the possibility to answer through the chat. It's
okay.
Yeah, now it's activated.
We still can't hear you.
Now it's again muted. What maybe we can do, Yankel, if you agree, we go ahead with the presentation by Michelle, and we dedicate the 15 minutes at the end during our discussion to the questions specifically related to Yankel presentation, because I think, and maybe in the meantime, I don't know if you want to try.
Yeah, another option is to try to call him maybe and play his voice from a different computer.
Okay, we can.
If you have his number, maybe through WhatsApp or directly.
I don't know if I am so familiar with the
tech savvy.
Yeah.
Okay, he's not here, Yankel, at the moment.
Safir, do you have Yankel number?
No, I don't, but we can ask.
We can try to do it, but if you agree, I would go ahead with the presentation by Michelle, and then we will dedicate the 15 minutes. Sandra, please.
No, I could call him on the cell phone and put it on.
That would
be great.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Perfect, thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you, Sandra.
Remains to be seen how much you can hear him.
Okay.
I'll put it
Yankel, I think that now there was a connecting audio, but you are again unmute. Sandra, it's calling, and you can answer by phone. So, okay.
Let's hope it will work.
Okay, and
Oui, on t'entend bien. Yankel, peut-être c'est toi qui parles, sinon.
Becoming a psychedelic experience.
No, really.
Yes, Yankel, we had an idea that maybe Sandra can phone you, and then we can hear you through her cell phone. So if you can answer her call, maybe it will work. Sandra, can you phone him again, or? Okay.
Maybe everyone has to have their microphones closed, because otherwise it kind of...
Okay, yes. I will also close
the problem for me for the recording, but okay. Sandra, if you have your muted, we cannot hear you. Your microphone has to be unmuted, Sandra. It's becoming something.
Yes, I think.
Sandra, if you have the microphone.
I know. I was talking to Yankel, but when I'm on the phone with him, and if I'm on the phone,
sorry.
It makes this
okay.
Ripple effect. Okay, so he says, let's move on. And Oren presents, and he tries to resolve it.
Okay, in the meantime, we try to resolve. I think it's the best option, because the risk is that not to have the time for the final discussion. So I will introduce our third speaker, who is Michelle Oren. She holds a PhD from the Faculty of Architecture and Town Planning at the Technion, and she's a lecturer in urban planning. She published several works on housing rights, and in work she compared the text of 189 of the world's national constitutions to learn about the variety of forms in which housing rights have been addressed in the text. So she has a forthcoming book that will be published in 2021, co-authored with Rachel Alterman, that is titled Constitutional Housing Rights, A Global Perspective. Michelle is currently a postdoctoral student at Bar-Ilan University at the Graduate School of Business Administration, and she is the head of the Urban Future Lab. So I will share Michelle's presentation, and we can start. Can you see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, just to be sure. Okay.
Our story begins in Congo, a town in Angola scarred by one of Africa's longest civil wars. In the image, Ignacio and his family. They are not fleeing drought, flood, or failed harvest. The province of Angola where they currently live is quite fertile. They are among the victims of the country's 27-year civil war, forced to move from their home territory by the terms of the negotiated ceasefire. Like the 500,000 people facing starvation in Angola, they are the victims of a man-made disaster in a country that should be teeming with oil and diamond wealth. Most of the internally displaced settle around the capital in musek or mud houses in the countryside. Angola has a serious humanitarian crisis. A cause of the prolonged war, the abundance of minefields, the continued political and military activities, but most of all, the depredation of the country's rich mineral resources by the regime. The year is 2007. Traditional construction techniques are wattle and dab walls and thatched roofs. There's virtually no electricity in smaller rural villages, and running water is intermittent or unavailable in many areas. Angola has a tropical climate with a distinct wet and dry season. The area around Luanda, and particularly by the south of the capital, sees the least rainfall. When it downpours, the melted mud plasters and debris are abandoned, and new houses are built in cleaner proximate area. But this is not the case. This time, Ignacio and his family were forced to leave, since the landlord claimed the land for development. That landlord in Angola is the state, identifying what De Soto calls the potential energy in assets that up until now served immediate physical purposes, houses used for shelter, parcels of land being sowed and harvested. And as the new brick technology arrived to Waku Congo, permanent houses were built by the state for retired officers. Soon after, in 2008, Angola signed an agreement with an Israeli developer to build the New Age village. These brand new houses were demolished to introduce a new model, Aldea Nova, a new village using the Israeli Moshav model of private smallholder agricultural and joint services, drawing ex-fighters, former soldiers who were receiving government pensions, creating a rental market and capital for mortgage. But this is not the story about the wealth and politics nexus of weapons, oil, and mega communication infrastructure projects. My project was driven by the concern for more than 400,000 Angolan refugees living in camps and settlements, lacking a permanent address, a concern for Ignacio and his family and their destiny, unable to rely on the government who displaced them in the first place. Several international declarations, covenants, and interpretations recognize housing as a human right. The International Covenant on Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights recognizes the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living for himself and his family, including adequate food, clothing, and housing, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions. This is the right to live somewhere in security, peace, and dignity. Requires adequate privacy, adequate space, adequate security, adequate lighting and ventilation, adequate basic infrastructure, and adequate location with regard to the work and basic facilities, all at a reasonable cost. Parties to this covenant must ensure security of tenure and that access is free of discrimination and progressive work to eliminate homelessness. Forced evictions, defined as the permanent or temporary removal against the will of individuals, family, or communities from the homes and land which they occupy, without the provision of and access to appropriate forms of legal or other protection, are a prima facie violation of the covenant. In 1991, a general comment to the International Covenant on Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights interpreted the right to adequate housing, breaking it into several components, acknowledging that housing is a compound term. But looking at the national level, we know that the practice of the recognition of housing as a right existed in national constitutions since earlier times. And so, in the year 2010, Angola legislated its new national constitution, introducing clauses that established the protection of access to housing to the young, economic protection and living conditions for the elder, and a specific article directed towards every citizen's right to housing and quality of life. In an effort to define what the right to housing is, the pioneer Michelman defines it as a claim upon organized society on behalf of each individual or household unit to assured access to minimally adequate housing. He does make a distinction between the right to housing and the right to be housed. According to UN representatives, the right to housing shall not be taken to imply that the state is required to build housing for the entire population, or that housing should be distributed for free to everyone, or that the state must fulfill all aspects of this right immediately upon legislation, or that the state should entrust itself or unregulated markets to ensure housing. Certainly, it does not mean that the right to housing will manifest in the same manner in all geographic locations. Now, according to Michelman, the right to housing exists based on three principal arguments or normative systems. The first is philosophical ethics, based on a universal need of shelter manifested in all the animal kingdom, where the lack of housing could mean an existential risk. The second argument is social justice, conducing to market correctives, based on the principles of equality and social minimum for decent living. And the third argument is law, a right to housing that is explicitly stated in legislation should be respected as part of the contract between the people and the state. So what conceptions of housing rights and state obligations are reflected in the text of national constitutions around the world? I focus in constitutions because this is the most basic law of the territory out of which all other laws emanate. The Constitution establishes the rights of individual citizens. A constitutional right to housing is a freedom granted by the government's constitution at the national or subnational level that may not be legally denied by the same government. For this purpose, I gathered the entire set of currently valid national constitutions, retrieving the relevant clauses and analyzing them across 50 different criteria. Constitutional housing rights clauses may appear in a variety of forms. This is a published classification between indirect clauses, for example, property rights, and embedded and direct rights that explicitly mention housing, within embedded, for example, as part of workers' rights or directly as a right to housing. For our purpose, we chose the two first groups, the direct and embedded tiers. Once sorted, the 133 clauses were grouped into 7 different categories. The first recognizes housing as a right. The second protects housing from abuse and deprivation. The third group are clauses empowering private persons to defend their homes. The fourth group establishes the duty of the state to create a housing plan or a housing policy or a housing fund. The fifth group establishes the duty of the state to provide the means to achieve housing by supplementing private initiative. The sixth group establishes a duty of the state to provide housing or distribute public estates, social housing, for example. And the seventh and last group obliges the state to assure the access of housing by minorities and dependent people to housing. Having sorted constitutional housing right clauses, an obvious question was, why do some countries do have them, why others don't? We look at several variables to understand this phenomenon. One of them is the Gini coefficient, asking whether social gaps would explain the existence of these rights. We did not find a strong correlation. Neither did we find a relation to the HDI, Human Development Index. We found both developed and developing countries with constitutional housing right clauses. A possible explaining variable was the legal system. We looked at civil, common, and mixed law systems, finding out that common law systems do not present any kind of constitutional housing rights. Also, the practice of releasing full-fledged constitutions is not embedded in common law countries. As for the contents, and the following slides show the different scales, the different range of wording found within this constitutional clauses. This slide shows the split between negative rights or protections and positive rights or provisions. And we can see how the language changes from protecting to empowering to assuring access, recognizing housing as a right, establishing duties to create mechanisms, providing the means, or providing housing itself as a positive right. The following slides show the range of findings among entitlement, eligibility, and responsibility criteria. Here we see the various categories ranging from ownership to rooflessness. So the most common category found among constitutions was actually reference to social public housing, found in 36% of the cases. But the cases range among title and registry through housing ownership or rental housing, communal possession and cooperative housing, through caregiving institutions, protections of tenants against unreasonable rent increases or rent control, protection from deprivation, protection from forced eviction, informal settlements of forced quarters. There is also a reference to nomadism, resettlement of displaced populations, and homelessness. The latter were achieved the lowest scores. Eligibility is particularly interesting. In a paper, I attempted to provide an index which brings together the categories of eligibility with a global perspective. Eligibility depends to a great extent on the country in which the claim is made, with a wide variation among countries in the standards to establish which populations are entitled to housing assistance or determining who is in need. It is reasonable to attempt to identify those national constitutions according to which it is easiest to qualify to housing assistance, as well as those where housing rights are too vague, for example, those who are silent. It is possible to compare the stringency of the eligibility provisions to determine the extent of inequality. It is also possible to quantify the myriad of ill-defined eligibility standards. So based on Fiskia, a sociologist that studies stereotypes, I found an ambivalence in stereotype content and the actual eligibility categories protected by constitutions. There is also a claim that civic stratification helps achieve greater social control, maintaining and justifying inequality. So here, for example, we may question why some countries give eligibility to everyone, while others entitle only citizens, or perhaps more exclusive groups like family or workers, youth and elder, as we saw in Angola, disabled, indigenous groups, the poor, those in need, inadequately housed people, or gender-based. As of responsibility to implement or provide the entitlements, findings show a strong acceptance among countries that housing, including plans, are the responsibility of national authority. Local authorities are given little consideration, about 9%, although their role in housing provision and social integration is crucial. And a small 6% and 5% are either responsibility of the private sector or shared responsibility with citizens. The Constitution of Guatemala, for example, delegates some responsibility to owners of enterprises in cases established by law. They are obliged to make available to their workers housing units that meet certain requirements. The same clause was found in several other Latin American states like Brazil, El Salvador, Honduras, Mexico, and Uruguay. And there are also silent clauses, about 13%, that either leave the responsibility unclear or to be further defined by law. So from a general glimpse, and this may be not at all surprising, if we look at the three different scales, the entitlement, eligibility, and responsibility, the red squares represent the highest concentration of constitutions. There are some global trends of what is widely accepted within the constitutions as far as housing concerns. So in entitlement, we will usually see the adoption of measures or policy without extensive explanations. Then further ineligibility, usually the entitlements are given to citizens. And the responsibility, it is widely accepted that it is state responsibility to provide the right to housing. Another aspect that deserves attention is the use of adjectives that reflect a certain vagueness. For example, by using terminology such as decent housing or adequate or proper or suitable according to need, sufficient living accommodation. These adjectives reflect a certain need to further interpret what this terminology means. Another subject that deserves attention is the vagueness used through adjectives in the different clauses. For example, by using the word decent, the word adequate, the word proper, suitable, according to need, or sufficient. These are all adjectives that are quite unclear and need further interpretation. To conclude, although the right to housing had been defined in terms of accessibility and was not meant to imply housing delivery, de facto, the majority of constitutional housing rights are positive rights that grant provisions. Another conclusion is that legal culture is the strongest explaining variable to the existence or lack of constitutional housing rights. Similarities and the genealogy suggest that most constitutional housing rights have been borrowed from one constitution to another, and therefore we find similarities that I did not discuss between, for example, the Angolan, the Portuguese, and the Brazilian constitutions. Did the 2010 Constitution of Angola introduce change? Well, the answer is very limited. In the year 2020, the state remains a significant holder of the housing stock, although it has ceased to be a major supplier of new housing in the Angolan market. Only 9,101 units were released to the market in the past year. Most of these were constructed by Chinese, Israeli, and Portuguese firms, and some of them were left incomplete when the credit lines ran out. So the housing shortage actually persists. So what do we conclude about constitutions and constitutional clauses? Well, in many of the cases, these are more of a visionary documents than actual codes of practice. Constitutions, according to Feiner, are like door locks. These are clearly unnecessary to honest people who pass the door, and equally are useless against the determined burglar. But they can, and they do deter the casual strollers who might otherwise come in and help themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. I really find this lens that you proposed interesting in the frame of this session because through the observation of constitutions, we really have an observatory that helps you to investigate the terminology, also looking through a comparative perspective to the transfer of certain measures, norms, and words from one context to the other with the adaptation and appropriation of certain. So I think that for the analysis of terms and words is a precious lens that add to other discussion, another perspective and another angle. I would like, if you agree, to start, since we just had the presentation, with the questions to be posed to Michelle, and then if you agree, Yankel, and then at the end we will have the 15 minutes of Yankel to pose questions to Yankel, and we will start our debate and discussion on the three presentations.
Yes, now you hear me now?
Perfect, yes. Wonderful. Okay, so who wants to start?
Gaia, if I may, being a bit pedagogical, but I would like to share a slide that I prepared also because of Gisela's lecture, and I would like to show,
perfect.
I am allowed to show the language of the Portuguese constitution, which is very interesting apropos affordability.
Yes, of course. Safir, can you allow her to? Okay, perfect.
Yeah, I'm
you are already, okay, perfect.
Just share
it. Be able to share. So this is the language. I have it on the left. You can see it in English translated and the original in Portuguese. And I highlighted the wording. So we discussed affordability does not appear in the language of the text. And it's very interesting because constitutions are autobiographical documents of countries, and you can learn so much about the culture and the history and the values of the people. And in a certain way, when we legislate our approach to what a society should be in a constitution, we also create some kind of permanency. Some of the social diseases that a society suffers from are actually embedded in the constitution and become values. Yeah, there's an article in the Bolivian constitution that says, don't be a thief, don't be a liar, don't be lazy. Yeah, and it does not mean that there are no people lazy or liars in Bolivia, but it's an aspiration that actually makes this words become part of the vocabulary of the people. So in Portugal, we don't find affordability, but this is the wording. I think they were mentioned earlier. So the construction of economic and social housing. This is the precise terminology. And another interesting thing, there's an article that is dedicated, as I mentioned, it's very similar also to the language of the Portuguese, of the Brazilian and the Angolan constitution, and the realities are completely different. So I was thinking also, while we saw the presentations, and if I had the opportunity to present this presentation back again, I would do it a bit differently by showing the wording beside the architecture. And then you can see actually the gaps between the different realities and the language used in the and the other interesting thing is that the Constitution of Portugal was legislated in 1976, and we saw the transformation in the market in 1974. So this might be one of the reasons inspiring that policy change. Yeah.
Yes, I was about to have that comment. Well, the document is from '76, and two years after a big revolution, and we had massive housing crisis. So the Constitution had to write a bit about the need to build economical and social housing for the poorest fringe of the population. So. It's a perfect document. Just another comment that, in fact, the Portuguese constitution includes articles on housing, but they are clearly not enough and operative. So we had to pass recently in 2019 a basic housing law to address these questions in a more operative way. With detail and with instruments and the time frame to accomplish some objectives. So I was just thinking about this when you said that a commitment regarding the rights of housing doesn't mean to deliver housing. So we clearly need operative instruments to achieve these objectives. And in Portugal, we are giving big steps to accomplish that now in 2020 and in the next 2 or 5 years, I guess. So thanks, Michel.
Yankel raised his hand. Do you want to say something, Yankel? You can just join.
Yes, no. It just yes, I enjoy also, but it's also to have a comment about the Gisela presentation and Michel presentation, of course, also was fabulous. Is that words are in evolution. And for example, about affordable, it was in the central debate of the European Central Commission on social housing. And they debate about how many income, 30%, it was a debate, 30% of the income for the housing. It was the difference between public and social housing, and the words affordable is in debate, and it's the same thing, I think, about right for housing. For example, decent housing in France. There's now a decree for 15 years now about decent housing, and they give in the law a content in the expression of decent housing was wide at the moment where it was written in the 1990s law. But now there is a very strong content inside because the renters can ask the owners that the apartment is not decent, and there is a procedure and a judicial procedure, and so that they can act with these words. But it's just to say that the words are in evolution, and it's difficult and it's our task also, but it's a very difficult task.
Michelle, do you want to answer, or we can go?
I see that Marina.
I cannot hear you.
Marina,
you have your microphone muted.
Yeah, sorry. I'm saying that I don't think, Yankel, that was a question. It was
a comment,
yeah,
yes.
it was a comment that I completely agree with. Yeah.
Okay. I would like just to add that, of course, each constitution, it's related to Gisela's comment, provide a photograph of very precise historical moments. So the use of certain words, the use of certain expression are really rooted in, and it's important to understand why, the reason why they are using certain, even in instrumental and strategic ways, certain keywords in this precise moment. I have a question, Michelle. I wanted to ask you, you provided a huge overview and analysis of the constitutions. Did you also try to, in some specific context, and this is also related to what Gisela was saying, to understand, to put in tension what is the text of the contents with some more operative tools or information related to the spatial translation of these measures and norms?
Yeah, the answer is not yet.
Okay.
And it is difficult because but also going through from constitutional law through the policy, through codes of practice, and then to feel there's so much politics and so many different forces acting in that trail that it's hard to deduce that one thing led to another. But I think the comparative work itself was interesting because I did see many countries that use the same language because they have the same cultural, they've been colonies, they've been colonized, and the language does not reflect at all what you find in practice. So borrowing words, for example, affordability is a borrowed word. It's hard. It's very hard to measure. But I get that comment very frequently. So maybe in the future I will do something about it.
Well, in this context, it was like a spontaneous
reaction. Completely.
But where have you also the aim to, I would not say to define a classification, because each parameter you use probably bring you to create different groups of constitutions, but is the linguistic aspect one of the parameters that you use to create groups?
Yeah, well, I call this, the methodology is called fishing expedition. So basically you go into the text without knowing what you're gonna find. And then out of each word, I created a new category. And then I classified them into different, well, starting with eligibility and entitlements and so on. And I also looked at the UN criteria to see the language, because some and I looked at the timeline to see if it was made before comment number 4 in 1991 or after, and trying to trace all that, this language of rights, how it has evolved and moved from country to country around time. And there's another thing, UNDP, the UN Development Agency, has a department that assists countries, mostly developing countries like South Sudan, for example, that recently had her constitution made. They help them writing the constitution, drafting this text. So we see lots of the terminology established by the UN appearing suddenly in the text of the constitutions of these remote countries that do not reflect at all their local culture. So there are lots of effect, and yeah, it's interesting, I think, as itself to study the dynamics. And there are also so many other subjects in constitutions that are looked like land policy, for example. So you can swim in the constitutions alone. Yeah.
Thank you. I would like to open to the participants the discussion if there are other questions for Michelle.
Mariana raised her hand. So, you can just,
so they cannot see the chat. Okay.
Yes.
Thank
just
you.
You can.
Switch on the camera and ask.
Thank you. Hello, and thank you very much, Michelle, for your presentation. For me, it's especially important and interesting since the Constitution, and I'm from Brazil, and in the Constitution here plays a very important role in the struggle for the right to the city and housing. And I think, like the others, that this kind of comparative research poses a very difficult challenge, even when they try to compare two countries. So I can imagine how hard is it for you. But it's also important to have this overview. And one of the challenges you just mentioned is the land policies, which the articles related to land that sometimes do not specify housing specifically, but are important. In the Brazilian Constitution, for instance, there was a strong struggle to have it there in 1988 after the democratization processes, which is the article on social function of the land, which is very often mobilized by the pro-housing social movement when they want to make sure that each place in the city has to fulfill a social function, and then housing is part of it, and then there is the struggle for housing. So I was wondering how you deal with this diversity of entries that you can have in the Constitution. And then we had finally we had an amendment that was also a result of the struggle. So it's always a tension. It's sometimes you do not have of course, we have a huge housing deficit, so you won't find enough policies related to the right to housing, but we will find the Constitution being used by social movements in order to, for instance, justify squattering, because in the Constitution it's guaranteed that each place has to fulfill a social function. So it's kind of in deep analysis only can lead to that. You probably know already the many different cases, but anyway. And also, if you need something from here, and please also to send information. And if you need contacts, perhaps you have already. But if you need people to interview, have good friends that know a lot about it.
Thank you very much. This is why this kind of conferences are so important. And I think much of the use of legislation in Ireland, for example, The right to family has been used in court to argue for different housing rights. So also through this kind of conferences, I learn about case studies from other countries. And this has been the main means for me to learn about what I call indirect clauses. Yeah, I saw, because I classify them. There's the direct clauses that mention housing explicitly. Then there's the embedded ones that have housing within them, but are not precisely a right to housing. Yeah, and there's the indirect clauses, like I mentioned, family rights, for example, that out of them you can extract, they have impact on the housing regime. The same with land. So there are many examples, and I started from there, trying to map the different laws, yeah, from literature mainly, and a bit of case law to understand. But I don't think I covered the indirect rights. Yeah, there's a published paper on that. Yeah.
Guy, I believe Carmen wants to speak.
Yes, I wanted also to welcome you. Ramos arrived and now can.
But Carmen want to speak. I put the end.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so I used the occasion to introduce you since I didn't at the beginning. Carmen, please. Okay, you can ask your question. Sorry, because I cannot see the
Thank you, Rui. Yes, I was sort of waving my hands for a while. I have a very short pragmatic question for you, Michel. I wanted to know if it's possible to have an idea who are the authors behind these constitutions on the one hand, and then on the other hand, building on both Yankel and Mariana's remarks, that is how do you call that, the evolution of needs, rights, and so on, and the way social movements embrace these same problematics. Do you know cases when the action of such social movements succeeded to put words in the Constitution concerning housing, rights related to housing?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Actually, there's both the South African and the Angolan case, which we've seen, well, it's no longer recently, 2010. We can try to trace the authors. There are signatories, and there, in some cases, are protocols, and in some countries, this is kept secret or disclosed. But I want to say that during the term I was working on the constitutions, they were also being revised all the time. Yeah, so different clauses. The clauses on housing are less commonly revised. The most revised clauses usually have to do with elections. But then, yeah, we do see a change in the language. I don't know if I can say, if I can point at a dramatic case of legislation. You know, one of the examples that comes up to my mind, I have the contrary examples. So one of the examples that come up to my mind with the Hungarian constitution in 2011 that was legislated and incorporated housing rights. And then right after, they went back to the old constitution. And I think this kind of social rights, social clauses are mostly used for social purposes by populist governors, and not because the country really means to provide housing. Yeah, this is what I see. In Egypt, the same happened. They legislated a new constitution with housing rights, and soon after they reverted to the old constitution. And just like that, the housing clauses were wiped, but they were never meant to be the main issue in the Constitution. Yeah, they're always part of a pack of other social rights. So yeah, I don't have such a heroic story to tell. On the other hand, Yankel can tell maybe about the French case with the Loi Dalle that was not constitutional, but made a big revolution with administrative courts in France. So yeah, unfortunately, no. I wish, Carmen, I had a story like that of big success.
Okay, yeah, I think that the question of who are the actors involved and who are the players, it's crucial in understanding, I think, the three presentations. But I wanted to ask if there is still from the participants one question for Michelle. If not, I would move to the moment of discussion devoted to Yankel paper that we had to postpone before.
Yes. I'm sorry for the sound, because my computer didn't understand when he passed from Meet to Zoom to Skype, and he was lost. So I explained him. And
he's right. I think the computer understood the situation. It's reacting. Okay. So
for your question,
yes,
yes, because I began to write, but it's better to speak. Yes, there was on utilities, for example, in the law 1948, was included also in the formalization of the social building construction. There was some articles about utilities and how it is included, but there's not a lot of formalization about that. And for example, now, no, just a few years before, we had a new kind of neighborhood, eco neighborhood to build, and in this formula, the ministry wanted to take a label on this kind of neighborhood, eco neighborhood, and they asked for to have some kinds of formulation and standardization, etc. And we had a discussion about that, but it was very difficult to evaluate.
Yeah. Because I was wondering also in your historical perspective in this moment of institutionalization of needs, but in particular in the shift between needs and aspiration, that I find that's a very important point. If beyond the normative frames and the law, you tried to investigate also looking not only at the apartment, but also at the facilities and the equipment, how these shift from needs to aspiration happen.
Yes. It's a long story, because Chambord-Deleuve at this time was in the challenging position with Henri Lefebvre. And Henri Lefebvre, I didn't have the time to explain more, but Henri Lefebvre wanted to open the right for the city, appropriation, etc. So Chambord-Deleuve put the terms aspiration. And the term aspiration is inspired, I think, with the social morphology linked by Maurice Alvax, and the way of how people take place in the place and give sense to the place. But his strong position was on normative position, on overcrowding apartment, etc.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is what I wanted to understand. Maybe we can, Carmen, please. Thank you. The microphone, Carmen, sorry. The microphone.
You are muted.
Yeah, sorry. I actually have a question which is directly related to one of the questions I asked before that to Michel. Yankel, thank you very much for your paper. It was very clear. You said it afterwards. Words are evolving, needs are evolving, but needs are about something which is both objective in the sense that we have to acknowledge the fact that the human being has needs, and they're subjective. So I'm very interested to know how they are measured. How do they evolve in their evolving? Because, for instance, when Michel showed beforehand that last slide with the Portuguese constitution, I write down it was the 65 article that appeared on your slide, Michel, saying that housing should have adequate size. What means adequate size? I mean, is it adequate 9 square meters, as for instance, the sleeping room is considered today in France? Is it only 4 square meters because the only thing that you need is just to throw a bed in that place? So I was interested a little bit in the mechanisms of the making of these terms behind the needs.
Yeah, the question is that needs is in the core of. I have chosen the notion of needs because it's in the core of the doctrinal theory in architecture, and also it's in the core of the housing policies. So I think it's very central, and they have different kinds of measure of that, and they ask statistics and in the 19th century, for example, what can be a size of the room? It's a room where you can put a bed. So they had a very strong reflection about what can be habitable. But now we still are in this same kind of discussion about is the reason why I said yesterday that needs doesn't give all the sense of habitation, but we don't know how to deal without that. And it's a question that we don't know what really is housing.
Well, this is true, but would you be able, and I won't insist more than that, to say who defines the needs? I mean, it's in this sense, my question was parallel to the question I asked Michel beforehand. Yeah. Who are the authors of these precise definitions? Because they seem to be quite precise.
There's many forces, many people, statisticians, physicians who are very, very clever and very powerful about on this question. Now the question is more asked to the technicians, to the ecological technician, for example. It depends, and I think that the fields of housing, what is a good housing, is the central question, and there's many professions who are telling what is the good housing. And there is a strong battle between all these kind of professions. And state, for the right of housing, for example, want to give an homogenization and to provide a good housing for some kinds of people. But in the other side, there is the market, and the market invent all the time new forms of housing. You see co-housing now, co-living, different form of housing and different norms. It's the reason why I think there is an archipelago of in the housing field, because every time there's new formula, new norms, and the facilities is an important question.
Roy raised his hand, so we can just ask.
Is Roy? Yes, of course.
Yes, I think it's not possible to speak in housing and not thinking in the city and the urban space, because it's not possible exist good housing without good urbanism and good urban space. This is for me a big and very important question, because in slides I see this morning, for example, from Michel, you see the kind of urban design they are developed in Angola and so on, in different kind, obviously in the Europe, in Madrid, in Portugal, in France, etc., etc., etc. The support is essential to the good housing. It's not possible to speak only in the good housing and missing the support is the land, the city, the urbanization. This is fundamental. After I agree, it's important to open the discussion to the quality of the inside the housing, the construction, etc., etc. It is a very important discussion with a big mark of time. Each time there are different understand what is a good housing. Another thing I want to speak, in some cases, I agree with Carmen, but perhaps in a certain moment of the discussion, they are two levels of laws. A constitution is a basic law. This is a kind of a guarantee for our living, and in the long time, like for example the Constitution of United States and the Constitution of Portugal. It is a basic law. This law is not possible to have a very specification of what is a good housing, but this is a guarantee of rights the people expect to live in this country, and they are another kind of laws. These laws, they are changing with the time. Today the law in Portugal, like Gisela and Luciana explained in their communication, they are completely different from the law they are started in the pandemic, in the 1,000 years ago. We cannot expect in the Constitution. We have a definition of housing, but the right of state can provide this kind of condition of living, like welfare state and so on. We cannot put the operational laws. They are in production all time, with the constitution. They are different ways of thinking. Okay, is that?
Okay, thank you, Rui and Carmen. I think this question posed by Carmen on how to measure needs when moving from quantitative to qualitative research analysis, it's really relevant. What I liked in your presentation, Yankel, it's that a plurality of declination of needs emerged, but if you think what how means for real estate market, for inhabitants, or for policymakers, of course, we have a diverse declination of the notions. What is clear that what has been framed today is through policies, so through certain laws that help us to have a lens to understand needs and this shifting needs between needs and aspirations. But I wanted to ask if there are more questions for Yankel, since we wanted to still keep the focus on his presentation from the participants.
I would like to ask one question to Yankel. I raised my hand, but
sorry, I cannot see.
Okay. In the coming back to the idea that the words are changing in time, and that the needs are getting more complex in time also. I would like to ask how to deal with the notion of need nowadays when we need to associate that word, that need, with requirements and aspirations such as energy efficiency and accessibility and etc.
Yes, there's two things just to add, because I had a few times to make the video and it is a very difficult exercise. And the things is that we have some kinds of a qualitative inquiries to invest the question of needs. And in 1946, for example, there was a strong struggle between the statisticians and humanism, social humanism, who wanted to have a qualitative but a normative but qualitative view on housing quality. That's one point. And the other point is that for example, for energy efficiency, we have a lot of research on directing PhD, for example, and some kinds of things, because the question is the sensitivity of inhabitants. And when people are cold or not, it's not evident, and so it's maybe we can have some other way to think about the needs. I don't think the normative way is a good way. I think also, like Ramos, that focusing on the apartment and the flat is a mistake. But I think that we can the notion on needs can be take by other think of a reflection about quality, more sensitive, more qualitative, and more open to the way of life and the way of sensitivity. But in the other time, I know that there's a very individualistic demand on housing. I've shown different books, for example, who are very individualistic. At Home is the title of a book. And I think that we have to manage between this very strict, quantitative, pseudo-objective, pseudo-scientific notion of needs, statistics and so on, and the qualitative one, and we have to find a way between that. It's my position. Thank you. Luciana.
Sandra raised her hand.
Thanks. I just had, thanks, Yankel. I think the entry into with the term needs, it's like fantastic, like it's huge, and it makes me think of a lot of things, and I think that the nice thing about your presentation is that you attempted, while knowing that it was not going to necessarily fit, but we always need to go through this process of making categories or periods, out of which of course things overflow. And so your 3 periods in between the war, with hygienic and the modern and the postmodern after the war, and all these things, you know, they I find are you know, helpful in understanding how the term has evolved, and at the same time, of course, there are after the war still hygienic remnants, and so on and so forth. I was wondering to what extent you would relate the evolution of these needs also to a a political context, but an environmental context, and all of these things, because I'm just thinking, for instance, you probably read this article in Critica by Ariane Wilson, where she explains how, you know, in the 40s or 50s, I can't remember, in the 50s, I think the average temperature of an apartment would be 14 degrees. And today, you know, the national housing, whatever, you know, requests that at 1 meter height into a room, you'd have 20 degrees. So that's obviously, that has changed, that we're not only norming square meters and light, but also feelings and temperatures and all that. And I'm not sure that we're going to be able to stay with 20 degrees in the future. You know, people might have to put on pullovers again and live with less heated places, just because of the way energy and environmental concerns are narrated, if anything, to us. So I was just wondering to what extent you would give us an understanding of the not only map out the evolution of the term, but also put it in dialogue with the whole environmental, in a very large sense of the word. I mean, not just in the strict ecological sense, but just the evolving political and whatnot situation. Is that something that you're already in the process of doing, or is that something that you find relevant? Or
Yes, thank you, Sandra. Yes, it was for me writing the paper about needs was a real challenge. I wanted to organize my mind and what I have, all the material I had to organize all the things I have about the notion of needs. And yes, it's a view, and it's a personal view on the needs. And about heating, I will tell you a story. I was invited by an electricity company, and I had a request that I have made a questionnaire, and they asked people how they heat their apartment. And all the people said 19 degrees, because it's the law of 19 degrees. And it was 18% of persons who said, okay, this degree. And I was the public. There was a lot of people, etc. And I said, oh no, it's all liar. All liar. And I found different inquiries said that the people don't heat at 90 degrees, but at 20 degrees, 21 degrees, etc. And so I think the norms the norms we provide us in urbanism, in architecture, in policies, in housing managers, etc., are include in the mind and in the mind of people. There is a kind of social control. And in this social control, people say, okay, I'm heating at 90 degrees, but it's not that. So the norms, the standards are playing a role to the way of life of people also. And so it's also reversible. I think. I don't know if I had an answer to your question, but really I think it's a strong debate.
But yes, your if I may still say something, Guyan, yeah. No, because what you're opening up a whole other, to me, interesting kind of research about, you know, the relation between imaginary or culturally constructed needs and actual needs, yeah. Which is a whole other, which is also very interesting, but you hadn't touched yet upon that. Okay, no, my question was more about the relation between, you know, how the evolution of the term needs is related to an economical, social, political evolution of the concept.
Yes. I have some answer. Or, for example, the question of Chambard-Delove in 1968, when he opened the terms aspiration to needs, because he was in fight with, in 1968, in a revolt, a Parisian revolt and French revolt, he was in fight with Henri Lefebvre writings. So he said, okay, he was on the right place. He said, okay, and the right wing. And he said, okay, I will open a letter. I will open with aspiration. Not right to housing, not right to city, but just aspiration. So I think you have many situations with the needs, with the notion of needs can be in balance with the political situation, of course.
Gaia, can I have a small question for Yankel? First of all, thank you, Yankel, for a very interesting paper. For me, one of the questions which aroused, because you spoke about people like Bonnier and like Silva, which had some impact on the people I'm now researching in Israel and Palestine at the time. I wonder if like places like the Paris School of Urbanism and those people also in a way defined needs that were afterwards exported. Like, is the idea of what was in a way thought to be needs in housing in Paris at the time, then travel to the colonies and to other places? And can we speak about the fact that maybe the needs that came to Palestine, for example, were actually the needs for people in Paris and not people in Palestine? Like those ideas maybe which were taught in these schools where people from other countries came to study, maybe they had this impact also on other countries, in a way translating these needs from one place to another.
Yes, I think it can be a research, but it can be some kinds of experiences. I remember, for example, about Israel. I read short sentences in Amos Oz novel when he spoke about his grandmother was keeping out all the dust in the apartment because for her Middle East was empty of dust and she has to clean every time, etc. So I'm very. I look a lot about hygienic comportment, hygienic behavior. So I think we can have some kinds of link with that. And just to say that Paul Rabinov, for example, in French Modern, he opened some windows on this kind of question also. But I think it's a way of research for the future.
Yes.
But,
thank you.
Okay, are there still questions for Yankel?
The Priscilla is out.
Perfect. Okay, thank you.
Sorry, it wasn't for Yankel. Well, but I don't know. Maybe it can be for Yankel and for Michelle as well. But because it's again back to the rights and right to housing. But Michelle, I wonder if you see in your research with the inclusion of right to housing in the Constitution and rights-based policies, it happens at the same time that there is an increase in housing production, and if we're talking about neoliberal states, you know, a lot of property development for accumulation. And we see, for example, in the case of Brazil and in São Paulo, that developers use the right to housing as a justification to increase housing production and affordable housing, even though it's not affordable. The market trying to produce affordable housing, and then it just happens that it's not affordable to the population that the right to housing seeks to address. So do you see that in your research, and what's your opinion on it?
Yeah, thank you. No, I don't see that in my research because I almost don't look at the practice. I look at the wording, but it does connect very well to Yankel's lecture and the discussion of needs, because what the Constitution does that is very important is to recognize that there is a need. Because before Yankel, like in the 90s, there was a big discussion about needs and wants, not needs and aspirations as Yankel proposed. And then, well, the claim is, and France is very radical on that subject, because according to law, you can force a person to go into a shelter if the temperature is freezing. You're saving his life. Yeah. That's not accepted in other countries. In the States, for example, that would never be well seen. But in the Middle East, for example, housing is not a right according to I forgot. Doyalengo, that's the name of the authors. So what they say basically is that for something to become a need, you need to be in an existential risk. You need X in order to survive, yeah? And in the Middle East, you can basically sleep outdoors almost the entire year, and you're not under an existential risk. So recognizing housing as a right is the most basic thing to start the discussion about aspirations, for example, of what we would like to this housing market to look like. And I think this is the interesting transition that we're seeing also in developing countries. Starting from a consensus that obviously, you know, what you see in the animal kingdom, everyone has a shelter and everyone has the right to build its own shelter, through the spaces of informality, where actually any kind of activity of construction you do becomes illegal. And I think connects also to the lecture, one of the presentations given yesterday, one of the lecturers where he speaks about the professionalism, yeah, how the architects came in and turned housing into their own territoria, yeah. So the professionals claimed ownership on construction, and then suddenly the people who were used to construct their own housing are doing illegal, are criminals, yeah. The criminalization of people who are basically caring for their basic needs. So we cannot see that actually through constitutions. The wording is very scarce and it's blurry.
but we do see the insertion, that adoption of different terms. And also, well, the Portuguese example we saw is the most extensively articulated right to housing in the entire world. It's the largest article. Most of the constitutions don't have an article dedicated to housing. And housing is not that important in constitutions, yeah? Some of them have it, most of them don't. So, yeah, very little that we can learn actually about the practice. But it leaves lots of space for future research.
Yes, I think to add something to what Michel said is that housing policies is a recent policy. It's recent policy. We emerged in the 19th century, and in this recent policy, the state appears as responsible of the life and the way of life of people. Before, it was a private contract between homehold and owner, and that's all. And in the 19th century, we have a turning point, and a lot of industrial countries come to housing policies, and it's the beginning. But because housing policy, what is to say to provide housing, to have a decent housing, to give decent housing for population, to give shelter, is the turning point. And it's at this turning point that we have we witnessing to raised of a central question. It's what is a good housing, and so there is a field, and there's a lot of specialists of good housing, architects, physicians, planners, etc., etc.
If I could just another reaction, I can't stop thinking about that since we're in a policy, and but also I listen to you, and this keeps coming to my head. So I'm just going to say we are in the middle of mayor elections for mayor, local government and vereadores, city council in Brazil, and one of the discussions in São Paulo is. So many houses without people, so many people without houses, yeah. Which is, forever. Since I graduated as an architect in Brazil, we discussed the vacancy, and so you have the housing need, but you have vacancy, and I just wanted to express that because it relates to the need to. But I don't know. I think in the case of São Paulo and the areas that I work, the need is so much just to get to the shelter that, and I don't know how does that feed into the discussion, but that's what keeps coming into my head. So I just wanted to put that out.
Thank you. I think Mariana wanted to say something.
Since I don't know if we're running out of time, I just wrote a few comments on that, mainly on the discussion between right to housing and political economy, in the sense that I've been discussing the hypothesis that eviction is so important part of the game of securitization that constitutions can be really, if not changed, but at least violated a lot in that terms. In the US, for instance, when there was the subprime crisis, the rapporteur for the UN I don't know how to say that in English, Priscilla, repertoire, I don't know. Raquel Ronicky went to the US and she said, how come it's not a housing is not a right here, and they said it can't be. I'm putting it very short, but it can't be because otherwise you can't evict. If you can't evict, you don't have securitization. I'm putting it very short. But the model, and the model is not just in the US, the World Bank has been spreading it all over the world. We have a story on that in Brazil. I won't tell it, of course, here. But it means that we have pressure here in order to make more fragile the right to housing, so that the banks can get back the housing as a ground for the financialization process. So I think that's part of this discussion. At least it's important that it's part of the discussion.
Thank you, Mariana. In fact, we decided to change a little bit the format, so this final moment of discussion is spontaneously arrived to be in a collective discussion about the three papers. So I had just a comment to bring back the discourse on what was our initial assumption on the role of architecture, and it's related to what Yankel answered to Sandra, that his attention to the moment, to the idea to observe the shift between needs and aspiration, it's linked to a very specific historical moment, political context, and this antithesis between the notion of need, the Freudian notion of needs, and the position, the choice of aspiration. So my wider question is related to, in particular, to the first and the second presentation, that in two different ways try to trace an history that it's still, of course, in the process of being shaped, but defining precise seasons also in this history, and defining some turning point, some moment that allow you to. This is, of course, a compromise, I think, and a work of mediation, because the history can be different. But I wanted to ask also to Gisela, Luciana, and Rui, also thinking in what Rui said, so that we are thinking in inhabiting not only in relation to the domestic space in the apartment, but also at a wider scale. Which are the main moments that helped you to mark this chronology, so to define these seasons that you addressed in the investigation on affordable housing?
Well, I think.
And sorry, if I can add, really one thing, so because it's what I asked Gisela at the beginning, if in this wider umbrella term, affordable housing, that is observed through policies as a legal framework, this history corresponds also to a moment of architectural research. So which is the role of architect, in your opinion, over this and of typological experimentation, if there is this interest, or if it's only related to an evolution of policies?
Sure, you are correct. In a very short sentence, you can tell you in 33 in Portugal we start the affordable housing with a kind of political and social control of population. In 45, we start another program of housing with the authoritarian regime, but with modern architecture, real modern architecture, not housing, individual housing, but buildings, and with modern language. And after revolution, with in 74, I believe, yes, there are a period very changing of everything, but they are a big issue. It is the total alienation of the buildings All buildings are selling to the inhabitants. And we start a housing policy with the financialization of the policy. That means the banks give you the money to buy a house. This is a clear option, a neoliberal policies for the crisis of petrol in 70s, after the 70s. And this is a political decision for this crisis, because you see the same crisis in Europe, like in the United Kingdom with Margaret Thatcher, have the same policy with the total destruction of the welfare state, and our policy of housing is fantastic in the United Kingdom. They are completely destroyed. But in Netherlands today they have a strong politic in housing with a big different type of housing, a big mobility of people in a lot of big families and little families. They are changing always the housing, and with this they have also a big control in the design of the urban space. This is very important for me. Speak with housing with urban space. You cannot think in housing without urban space. And for instance, in German, we have the same decision, not go to the financialization of the policy of the housing, but keep the housing in the lands, in the municipality policies, with the big traditions of the Siedlungs and the Austrian with the Hofs, and so on. For me, the very interesting question, the housing is always a political question, a political weapon, and this is a decision with a very strong financial impact, with big lobbies in the playing with the decisions. But Gisela and Luciana can speak more precisely in the last few decades, if you want.
Yes, I think the Mapping Public Housing project allow us to have a big picture of what has been done during a large period during the 20th century. It allowed us to collect information that was spread in several institutes, and to, for example, to know how to respond to a simple question that Rui talks a lot about it. How many neighborhoods were built in Portugal during these 6 decades or 7 decades? We collected around 650 neighborhoods built during this period. And how many dwellings were built? We counted them. It's around 90,000 in 7 decades. Well, and when the public secretary of housing says that in the next years they are going to deliver 170,000 dwellings in 5 years, well, I don't think if he has or she has these numbers. In 7 decades, we delivered 900 dwellings, 90,000 dwellings, and now 170,000 dwellings in the next decade. Well, this is a bit overwhelming. So the project allows us to build this narrative in time and to look at the recent instruments that are being developed and put into practice nowadays, and to have a critical perspective, because we have the data and the public mapping public housing enabled us to have concrete facts and numbers to contest these new instruments that are being implemented. In regards to the affordable term, like I said previously, I think nowadays it's more like a concept and not a term that we use in building construction. Well, we talk about it, just to talk a bit with Rui about it. We use the terms economical, cheap, low-cost construction, sustainable construction, and the term affordable is a bit abstract. But for us in Portugal, it means accessible, a type of building or type of dwelling that everyone can gain access to. So it includes the middle classes, the young people, the older persons, the lowest fringe of the poorest fringe of the population. So it's a wide hat for many terms and concepts and issues that are being debated nowadays in Portugal. Thank you.
And also to finish, to perspective the future, the database also started to collect the interventions that were made in the last years, like in Porto with the plano de melhoramentos for the municipality, and nowadays with an intervention that is planned with the Institution for Habitation and Rehabilitation in Lisbon, that is also planned a huge intervention in the next few years. And with this work that was started with this database, we also can follow this work that will be done in the years that come.
Thank you. Yes, I was interested in the criteria and the aspects you look at that in defining this chronological frame, because also the case of Yankel with a totally different lens had this aim, this attempt to trace a narrative and history that can change a lot if you think affordable, as Sandra was saying before, as a notion, what does affordable means today in the rhetoric of real estate market, in the perception of people, or in the policy. So I think there were a lot of interesting interactions between the three papers. I don't know if it's late, if someone has a final, last conclusive comment.
I do have a short question. First of all, thank you for chairing this session. Will this conference have some kind of continuation later into a project? Is there a thought into it?
Yes, the idea is that the project that started 10 months ago was the initial occasion to establish a discussion on the terms of habitation with this particular perspective. This is, as I said yesterday, really the first moment of public discussion and exchange with but I think that this is just a personal concern, that the map that is emerging of housing researches in the last 5 years is extremely interesting, also with the very diverse research traditions and approaches, and I found it also challenging. So the idea is surely to continue with this research, and our aim, as the director of the Institute said yesterday, is to have another meeting in presence in 2021 or 2022, since we still have these resources and these.
We can try using artificial intelligence to produce a greater, database, using all the data that has been collected.
it's the second day, and I think are emerging very interesting lines of investigations. So I thank you, Michelle, for the. I want to like to know if there are some final conclusive remarks. If not,
Yes.
I think I don't know what you think. Yes.
My remark was that yes, my remark was that between with these three presentations, I think that the question of the presence of the state is the state and the organization, the national organization, and maybe the international organization. The state is the definition of what is housing, how it is good housing, how to provide, and I think it's the central, and it is the reason why we are thinking about the question of words. It's because there is a very strong need of definitions of what we are thinking about in architecture, in urbanism, and
yes,
etc.
It's an urgent need, I think.
Yes.
And response to this call for paper was really the confirmation, I think, that can be the starting point to establish this discussion, to work on the declination, definition, and different interpretations, also in a plurality of different disciplinary fields, because what I think enriched our discussion today is really to have diverse angles and perspectives on the topic. So I don't know, Safir, what do you think? I think we can.
I think we should.
Because the other sessions will start soon. So I really want to thank all the three, well, all the speakers in the first phase, three speakers, all the commentators, the discussion, the participants who contributed to this very rich exchange, and also Safir for helping me in this
thank you, Gaia.
session. So we will meet this afternoon, and thank you to all of you for the contribution.
See you later.
Thank you. Bye. 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 Bye.
Thank you, Gaia.